Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today's Executive Forum webinar with Profit Recovery Partners and McDermott and Bull Executive Network. Today's forum will be hosted by Mike Solis from Profit Recovery Partners with the topic of disruption work, stories from the front line of the business process optimization movement. Please welcome Mike to today's forum.
Thanks for that introduction, and hello everybody who's joining us. We're really excited today to talk about this particular topic, more specifically process improvement. We've labeled our webinar today Getting to the Point because it will be an hour. It will be fairly straightforward and high level, but we believe the lessons that we're going to share with you will really resonate throughout any initiative that you want to take on for your business or even in your personal life. Thanks again to McDermott and Bull for hosting this webinar. It is the third in our series of webinars, and thanks to everyone who's joining today, now the largest. So we broke a few records in terms of attendees, so again, thank you for that. We encourage you to ask questions throughout this webinar. You can do that using the chat feature on the Zoom platform. It's really easy to get to. You just scroll down to the bottom of your screen and hit the little chat bubble. As questions come up, please feel free to ask them. We will leave plenty of time at the end of this webinar to answer as many questions as we can. And our panelists have also offered to spend a little bit of extra time at the tail end of this designated time slot, or even after the fact if there are more questions that you have for them. So our commitment to you today is to make this webinar enlightening, interesting, energetic, and if that wasn't enough, everyone who's attending today will receive a free downloadable book by one of our panelists today. You will be the first to receive this book, so it's a pretty special treat for joining us today. So moving on to our panel, when we were searching for panelists, we wanted to make sure that we were bringing perspectives from coast to coast or from various backgrounds. We have a consultant, myself, we have an executive yogi, and also a process engineer. So the ideas and the thoughts that you're going to hear today are going to cover a pretty broad spectrum. They're going to give you a lot of insight, some of which are used to hearing, some of which hopefully will be new. And again, I'm really excited to have all these folks joining me, and they're going to introduce themselves here in just a moment. But first, a little bit of background on myself. I'm pleased to be hosting this webinar. In the last 15 years, I've been a consultant for a firm called Profit Recovery Partners. We are the largest consulting firm that not only implements cost savings initiatives, but also does line item verification. So we think that's a differentiator for us. And as I've gone through the ranks at Profit Recovery Partners, I've learned that someone's success is very much dictated not only by nature, but also by nurture. That's at least my belief. So I was given gifts by my parents that I've then honed while working at this consulting firm. And my personal claim to fame, at least my own personal wow story, is that I once advised an executive team at a Fortune 500 company to redesign a workflow that generated over 23% savings. And that was verifiable savings, by the way. So one of the reasons I think that you're going to hear great stories, not only from myself, but the rest of the panel. And the first panelist I'd like to introduce is globally recognized, which is really neat, and Neeti Dewan. I'll go ahead and pass it over to her, and she can give you a quick overview of herself.
Sure, thank you, Mike. Hi, everyone. My name is Neeti Dewan, and if you're wondering what my name means, Neeti actually means good policy, and Dewan stands for leader. So I try to be a good policy leader most of the time. I'm a tax principal at Ryan LLC. I manage the global transaction tax compliance practice for them, which includes sales and use tax compliance, business license compliance, Canadian compliance, as well as VAT in Europe and GST. I was born in India in the city of Agra, which is home to the Taj Mahal, and that's the beginnings, the humble beginnings of my executive yogi career. my personal wow story is that I once turned around a business unit from negative margins to double-digit margin growth by implementing some vigorous process improvement practices.
Awesome. Thanks, Neeti, for joining us. And again, Neeti brings a great perspective here, not only a true executive, but also with a yogi philosophy, which will explain exactly what that means later and how it can impact your process improvement initiatives. Next with us is a gentleman by the name of Kyle Kumpf. Kyle joins us from the Midwest in beautiful Dubuque, and he'll give a quick introduction on himself.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. As Mike said, I'm Kyle Kumpf. Unlike Neeti, I don't know what my name means. I'm sure it's not as interesting as hers. I've had a unique career. I worked in the distribution, supply chain, manufacturing, and financial services industries. And I'll just start by saying that I believe that change is inevitable. That sounds cliche, I know, but embracing it is optional, and I'm one who chooses to embrace it even when doing so is uncomfortable or even maybe daunting. I get to spend my days working with others, the people who are doing the work down in the trenches day to day, to help them learn to see everything as a process. And if we can change the process, we'll get a different result. And if we improve the process, we'll get an even better result. And I simply go and do this by going to the Gemba, the place where the work is done. I observe what's happening. I ask why repeatedly, or just ask a lot of questions in general, and show respect while doing so. It's not the quickest way to get results. However, it is the most sustainable in my experience. And I live each day by a quote that I have hanging in my office, and it's simply, we can't do today's work with yesterday's processes and expect to be in business tomorrow. And as I speak throughout the webinar, I'll touch on how I have used this mindset to once convince an entire boardroom of executives to change a process that had existed for more than 20 years.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. And again, Kyle's perspective is definitely a true professional with process improvement. I believe that the title at the place of where you work is AVP Process Improvement. So no better person to join us here than somebody who literally lives it every day. Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. So the next thing we wanted to talk about is the why. The why process improvement. And this may be pretty straightforward and obvious, but we still wanted to spend a little bit of time. So, Neeti, for someone like you, and definitely for an organization like Ryan, who has grown tremendously throughout the years, you have been, I'm sure, not shy in terms of process improvement initiatives. But why is process improvement important in general? And then also for Ryan, maybe you can give a few examples of why it's important for your firm.
Sure. So, when you look at our economy today, we are all part of a large global economy. We have rapid competition, rapid technological changes, business changes all around us, right? And all of these things require continuous improvement because things are changing. So the old processes from yesterday may not work today. So we constantly have to be vigilant and see what needs to be changed. So growth has to happen almost on a daily basis. And from a Ryan perspective, our purpose as one of the largest tax firms in the world is to empower and liberate our clients from the burden of being overtaxed. And nobody likes to be overtaxed. Nobody likes to pay more taxes than they need to. So in order to do that, as trusted partners of our clients, we have to, not just have to, we must stay on top of best practices in the area of taxation, of course, but beyond that, in the areas of people, processes, and technology, right? So at Ryan, we believe that transformation has to be deliberate. It just doesn't happen. You have to put your energies in that direction. And our CEO, Brent Ryan, has supported the launch of what we call Ryan Innovates, which is a portal where all employees are encouraged to share their ideas for improvement and innovation. So, Brent encourages everyone at all levels, including new staff, to the administrative assistants, to even principals, to drive new ideas for process improvements, which help our firm, of course, but then in turn, they allow us to deliver better service to our clients and drive better, meaningful results for them. So kind of looking at that, from a global level, as a firm who is assisting other clients, we must keep up with changes and we must focus on process improvement. Otherwise, we get left behind, and in turn, we aren't able to deliver to our clients the great profitability that they're looking for, as well as improved cash flows and better value.
Good insights, Neeti. So in other words, you owe it to not only the organization, in this case, Ryan, you owe it to the people in your business, and you owe it to your clients. So those are all really powerful reasons to take on, a process improvement initiative. And to your point, and what Kyle said earlier, it's really not a choice anymore.
Absolutely. We got to be nimble, and like you said, Mike, it's not just for us and for our employees, but we have other people really looking to us to make sure that we are keeping up with everything, so that it helps them in the process as well.
Yeah. Kyle, what do you think about that, the whole why around process improvement? Earlier, you stated that it's inevitable, but what are your thoughts around why it's important to not only an organization, but the individual?
Well, I absolutely agree with what Neeti said, and I think it's ultimately how companies can potentially gain a competitive advantage. Like we've stated multiple times to this point, change is inevitable. It's going to happen. And if we can't deliver our products or services to our customers better and faster than the competition, we're soon going to become irrelevant and not be in business. And I believe that companies have a responsibility to their employees to stay in business, to provide that employment to them. So it's important that they embrace change, embrace process improvement, and continually looking for new ways to deliver their products and services to the market.
Good. It kind of really enforces the quote there that we have on the bottom of the screen. Kyle, I believe you supplied this quote, but what's the importance and relevance of what Socrates said?
Oops. Exactly. I think it just speaks to taking a perspective of what can be versus what is. So if you're focusing on the perfect state, what we can be doing, and take that perspective versus the what is, why can't we do something, that's how you're going to get ahead. Good.
Yeah. And the word too that really resonates for me in that quote is energy. It takes a lot of energy to go through these initiatives. We'll talk about that a little bit more. The imagery that we chose for this particular slide is not an easy road to navigate, but again, that's one of the things that we want to leave this group with, is an emphasis on the amount of energy that's required to make a good process improvement and to see it through. All right, good. So before we get started with some of the meat here, we talked about the why, and Kyle, I wanted to pose this question to you. Your job is to live process improvement every day, so I figured this particular segment would be best told by you. But what's the reality for someone who's leading a process improvement initiative? What can you share with us?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say at a high level, any initial idea is much like a newborn child. It's not fully formed, developed, or even clean. It may even look a bit unsightly to outsiders. However, with constant nurturing and care.
And let's show people the imagery here. Jessica, next slide, please.
Yeah, so with that nurture and care, it can mature into something spectacular, much more attractive. The tricky part is just getting people to a place where they can see what can be versus what is, kind of what I alluded to earlier. And once they have that light bulb moment, that's where the magic can begin. So as you can see here, this is initially what people see when they aren't or they haven't been involved in that new process design that's being proposed. They look at it as potentially something that's intimidating, scary even, because it's trying to encroach on the status quo that's been in place for years. So again, getting people to that state of, yes, it might be scary now, but here's where we can get to. That's what takes that patient persistence, and it's going to take multiple iterations and presentations and demonstrations in order to to get people to reach that light bulb moment. But if you can get through that, it's very rewarding, and everything else just almost falls in place after that.
Yeah, and sorry to any cat lovers out there, but we wanted to use some imagery that really showed the reality of the situation. So as Kyle described, and I'm sure a lot of people have experienced this themselves, they have a great idea, they bring it to somebody, and they hate it. So that's going to be normal in some cases, and we want to make sure that you're encouraged to not only bring hard evidence to the table that supports your idea, but also to be persistent, as Kyle had said. Neeti, in your experience, whether it's at Ryan or in other executive positions that you held, is this concept of how you see it versus how others see it still relevant?
Absolutely. You know, at the end of the day, Mike, we're all human, right? So anytime there's a new change proposed or there's a shift in the status quo, what's the first thing that goes through anybody's mind? I mean, I know personally, the question that pops up for me is, what does this mean for me? You know, how will this impact my job? What about the people I work with? I've mastered these processes now, but where will this change leave me? How are we going to make the change? Why are we going to make this change? So I think we as leaders must address these concerns up front, because change is inevitable. However, we have to make sure that we personalize it and answer these questions for people so that they are less concerned, and they can, you know, we don't have this image of a cat, a reaction from them, but we have them like the dog reaction in the other slide that you had, where they hold on to the ball because now it becomes their project and they're fully on board.
Yeah, good. Again, I think this is a common sentiment that we've all experienced. So our advice here is not to necessarily avoid it, but to expect it and adjust accordingly. So with that said, too, we talked a lot about people and how they can influence any sort of process change. If we go to the next slide here, Neeti's going to give us a little overview of a philosophy that she's developed called the Executive Yogi. She has a book on it, and as we said, another book is coming out, which everyone who's on this webinar will have the opportunity to download for free when it comes out. But this idea of focusing on the people part of process change, focusing on the feelings of people, and creating a synergy between that aspect and the one we all know really well, which is the theory and the mechanics behind process improvement. We wanted to bring to the table a little bit of a different element to layer on top of it. So Neeti's going to give us some perspective on her thoughts around the Executive Yogi and exactly what it stands for.
So, you know, I didn't always have this focus. I used to be, many years back, very mechanical. That process improvement goes from step 1 to step 10, and then you're done. And over the years, I realized that there must be the human element to it. It has to permeate throughout the process. So years back, when I had my business consulting firm, I was working with a very successful multinational technology company. And the company leaders and their PE firm that was backing them had this great idea for a new technology implementation. So they budgeted for it, they invested a large amount of CapEx on this project, which ultimately and unfortunately failed, and it had to be scrapped after a few years. You know, that's very disappointing when you've invested a lot of time and money and things don't pan out the way they should have. So once it happened, you know, I kind of asked myself, and I reflected and said, what went wrong? Why? And I realized that the people focus was missing from the whole project. And the lessons learned were, first, we've got to seek the insight into the project. Then we've got to seek the involvement of the people. The next step would be then to look for a solution and then follow through. Versus what happened in that case is the leadership already had a solution in mind, so they had skipped over step 1 and 2 and gone straight to knowing the solution and trying to follow through, and that didn't work. So I came up with this technique, and I called it the yogi technique. Why is it has to be you focused. We've got to make it personal. How does it impact each division? Then how does it impact each department, each team, and then each employee? We've got to address those concerns for them. The next step is having the organizational knowledge. What is working today and what is not, and why? We must understand the people involved in the process and their motivations, their fears, and what their goals are. We've got to lay out the current process, because if we don't know where we are today, it's very difficult to map out where we want to go tomorrow. And if we don't know what's working today, then it kind of becomes like a nebulous, squishy problem that we can't put our fingers on. The next step is global. Was there a question? And the next step is global.
Sorry, Neeti, I'm not sure who that was. If you can go through the G again, thank you.
Okay, so G stands for global thinking, but local linking. So what do I mean by that? Global thinking is where leadership has to lay out their vision, but we have to have local employees involved in the process and the execution of it and the ownership of it to make it successful. So again, global thinking for the vision, but local linking for actually executing the whole plan. And the last step is I, which stands for integrated success and individual excellence. What do I mean by that? So, the success of a company's project must be tied to the individual goals of each employee. So we've got to make some connections for them to see what their inputs are towards that success, what actions will they take personally towards the success of that project. There's got to be individual ownership and accountability. And as soon as you start getting employees who are talking about, I need to take these steps versus we need to do this, or somebody on the team is going to do this, or the project is doing this, you've got a winner. As soon as people say, I am going to take these particular steps, now you've got a connection of the heart, mind, and feet. People feel the project, they know where they're going with it, they're sold on the project, and now they start moving their feet towards it. So that's what the executive yogi way is and what the YOGI stands for.
Thanks for that overview. I really love the perspective. It's rooted in some fundamental concepts, but given a broader perspective with this yogi mindset, which is really, really neat. And Kyle, from your perspective, someone who I think graduated with an engineering degree, if I'm not mistaken, so your approach, may be a little bit different at first, but how does this yogi methodology, which I think you've recently heard from Neeti as well, kind of play into what you might do in the future?
Yeah, and this is the first time I've heard of this, and I think it's very interesting. And actually, I think it aligns very well with what I call the learning cycle, or the Deming cycle you might refer to as, which is PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act, which is more of the systematic approach to how do we solve problems. And I think what Neeti presented here with this yogi way is more of the human side. How do we get humans to a point where they can support this learning cycle and use it over and over again and learn from it to solve problems.
Yeah, the concept of artificial intelligence, which is a whole nother topic, kind of leads people to believe that the human element may not be as important, but in reality, it still is very much important, and nothing's going to happen without the input and the support of many people.
Right.
Good. Well, thanks again, Neeti, for giving us that perspective on the yogi way. On the next slide here, we have a little bit more of a traditional step-by-step that we want to take you through. Again, we're going to give you perspectives from Neeti's standpoint as well as Kyle's standpoint, a 6-step process that we've developed for this webinar: scoping, discovery and baseline, process design, optimization, implementation, and handoff. So again, there's a bit of a structure here that we want to take you through, but with different perspectives along the way. We've all been there following, whether it's a model similar to this or a different model. But another kind of point that we wanted to hammer home was all of these steps aren't our favorite or aren't glamorous or aren't easy. And I wanted the opportunity to ask both Neeti and Kyle, out of these 6 steps, what's your favorite and why? But also, what's your least favorite and why? Coming from folks who manage process improvement every day, we know that there's both sides of the story. So we wanted to share with you all what their thoughts were. So first, Neeti, what's your favorite step and why?
So, my favorite step in this whole 6-step project is implementation. And the reason is, honestly, have you guys heard the adage, ideas are a dime a dozen? Well, it's very true. Many people come up with great ideas and strategies. Companies come up with brilliant ways of doing new things. But at the end of the day, most fail to follow through the implementation of those ideas. So the joy and the satisfaction of seeing a project that's deployed and has achieved the milestones and eventually become part of the culture of a company is immensely satisfying. So I would again say implementation is my favorite part of it. And as far as least favorite, I would say the last step, which is hands-off. And the reason is, when you've worked on a process improvement project and it takes some time, right? It doesn't happen overnight. So all of a sudden, it kind of becomes your baby. It's something that you are nurturing and you are learning from. And eventually, when you have to pass it on to the people who are going to live it day in and day out, it almost feels like it's kind of giving up your baby, right? But again, however, at the end of the day, it's a sense of accomplishment because you know that the stakeholders have taken ownership of the process, which in turn will improve the overall experience for them and potentially for the clients and customers, and improve profitability or whether it's EBITDA, whatever the goals were. It is, again, immensely satisfying. So it's a bittersweet step in the hands-off process.
Yeah, you and I are really well aligned on that one, Neeti. I love the implementation as well. It's where the magic happens, and then the handoff is the hardest part, giving it up. So I definitely I feel you on both of those. Kyle, what about you? What do you really enjoy, and what do you wish you didn't have to do?
Yeah, I was going back and forth on my favorite between implementation and process design. So I'll just take a different route, and I'll say my favorite's process design. And that's because where the team, the group gets to come together and actually create what's going to be implemented or what's going to be proposed to be implemented. And that's very exciting to me. So that's where, again, you're pulling together the people, the stakeholders, and showing them that vision of here's what can be. Let's design this to reach that versus what we currently have. And so that's very exciting to me to work through that step and that phase of the cycle. And I would say my least favorite would be, to Neeti's point, it is tough to hand off a project or to have it come to a close, but I would say the first step, scoping, is the one I probably enjoy the least from my experience, because this is the point where everything's just getting started. You don't necessarily have all the information you would like to figure out here is what is in scope. And so that's, it's the least enjoyable to me. However, with that caveat, I'll probably touch on this later. The scope doesn't have to be perfect up front. You just need to get enough defined to move forward to the next step. Once you get that information, that data, then it's potentially possible to come back and refine that scope a bit. But in my experience, I found that initial scoping to be kind of like herding cats. Sometimes it seems very, very difficult.
Yeah, and anyone who's taken the DISC profile and who scores a D gets a little maybe agitated with something moving slowly out the gate. So I'm with you there too. That can be a little frustrating to get things going. So, but again, still what really important step in the whole process. So speaking of, let's go to scoping. So now we'll dive into each step here in a little bit more detail, get perspectives from both Neeti and Kyle. If we can move to the next slide. So for scoping here, each one of these slides is going to be formatted the same. So we have a quick key for success. It's going to be the same summary from the 6-step process, as well as keys for success in bullet point form. So on this first one, Kyle, since you don't really like this one, I'll turn it to Neeti. Where do we start?
So, looking at scoping, I again start with the human side of it. So step one would be to identify the stakeholders and ask ourselves a question. Are they supportive or are they against the project? Do they have power? Do they have a great deal of influence? Because you're going to need a little bit of both. So either way, we've got to improve these relationships and level set with them at the very beginning of the project. And we've got to ask ourselves, who makes a good candidate for a stakeholder, right? Can they persuade others to adapt and support the project? Do they inspire others to work enthusiastically towards the project objectives? Do they instill trust in your desire and abilities to achieve these results? And are they able to accurately diagnose any problems and then come up with creative solutions for these problems? So I look for the right stakeholders as step one. Step two is setting the ground rules and hosting a kickoff meeting. So what do I mean by ground rules, right? So for any project, it makes it much easier when all the participants and stakeholders of the project are on the same page. We know that if we run into an issue, how are we going to attack it? How are we going to solve for it? So if we've addressed those questions from the beginning, it makes it easy. Those are, rules on how the team will interact. Are we going to have weekly meetings, monthly meetings? Are we going to be sending emails out with minutes? Are we going to have conference calls, or do we all need to fly in and meet live? What are the parameters around us working through this project? When we have to make a decision, are we going to base it on a quorum or a consensus? What do we do with stakeholders who are over-talkers, right? Somebody just takes over the meeting. How do you shut them down in a nice way? And if there are under-talkers, but they have a lot of value to add, how do you get them to engage? Is attendance going to be required? And what is the user testing going to look like throughout the process? So those are, some ground rules that I think we all need to sit down and put down on paper before we kick off the meeting. Step three for me is process mapping the as-is state. So just like the GPS, if you're going somewhere, you need to have 2 points, your origination and your destination. And that helps you plan out the best route to take, right? So, are you going to take toll roads? Are you going to take highways? If you get a new offer from your GPS saying, hey, you can save 4 minutes if you take this different route, are you going to do that? So that, as long as you know where you're starting from, it really makes it much easier to plan out where you're going. And last step is, of course, we've got to know where we want to end up. We have to have the destination in mind. And sometimes without planning, and even if you plan and only listen to a single voice example, that of a GPS, without heeding any warning signs along the way, it's very possible that you could end up in a ditch or a dead end. I think we've all seen some videos on YouTube where this has happened, right? And we laugh about it. Well, same goes with projects. So we've got to listen to leadership goals and the vision, but along the ride, we've got to listen to the stakeholders who are involved to make sure that we're heading towards that step 4, which is, where do we want to end up? Are we heading in the right direction? So I'd say these are my 4 steps.
That's great, Neeti, and I'll be sure to Google or go to YouTube later and try and find a video called "Epic Process Fails." Probably won't find it, but I'll try anyway. In terms of the effort that goes into the scoping initiative, based on your description, there's a lot of work that needs to be put in out the gate. I would imagine it's something that's rarely done. And Kyle, in your experience, not only what Neeti described as the key elements, whether or not you would agree with those, but also, do you find that people often underestimate this first step or don't give it enough attention that it needs?
Absolutely. I think that's probably one of the common project pitfall you will find. Essentially what the scoping step here is describing is defining that charter, kind of that true north. What's this team going to work towards? And too often groups don't put enough effort into this and just move forward, and they have that lack of direction. Instead of saying we want to go to San Francisco, they just say we're going to head west, which means they could end up anywhere, and then the project ends up meandering off into 100 different directions and nothing ever really gets done. So yes, that's absolutely a potential pitfall if you don't spend enough time on this step.
Yeah, so it sounds like specificity is very important out the gate to give you and your team, guidelines. Like you said earlier, Kyle, you won't know all the answers out the gate, so you got to move forward with what you know, but it's got to be as specific as you can be.
Right.
So now that we've scoped out the project, now we got to roll our sleeves up, do some discovery and baselining. Kyle, in your experience, what makes for the best results when conducting both discovery and setting a baseline to measure success?
I would say quite simply, leave preconceived notions at home. Don't let your mind or your judgment be clouded by what you already think is going on. So when you go into a certain area, whether that's you're just looking at a process, going to a department, or you're doing an overview of an entire organization or supply chain, in order for discovery to happen, we must have an open mind and be willing to accept anything that we find. We got to have that learning mindset instead of the I already know or I've already learned mindset. So my keys for success here in this stage are pretty simple. The first one is go to the Gemba, which if anyone on the phone is familiar with lean, they've probably heard this term quite often, and it simply means the place where work is done or where value is added. So it means get up away from your desk, out from behind your computer, and go to wherever there's a problem occurring. That could be in another office, that could be on the factory floor, at the loading docks, what have you, but just go there. And once you're there, observe what's going on, see what you can see, looking at someone who might be loading boxes onto a truck, or someone sitting at a desk at a computer processing a mortgage application or something of that nature. Just sit there and observe for a little while so you can kind of gather what is actually happening, and then move on to the next key for success, and that's just ask why, or be curious. Now that you've had that observation, you know what questions to ask. Like, hey, John, why are you putting boxes from here to here? Or Susie, why are you moving this paper from here to there? It gives you some direction as to what questions you should be asking. And then finally, throughout all of this, the key thing here is just to show respect the whole time you're doing this. And one way that you do that is by do not be critical on the people doing the work. Ask questions like, this process is causing this result. Why is that? Versus, John, you're creating this result. So it just creates a much more, a better perspective for those people to come from and help them solve a problem. I like to say, if we go into a department or a line of business already thinking we know what the problem is, we're setting ourselves up for failure. We'll get tunnel vision, we'll miss key data and information. And that's one of the key things of discovery, is trying to find out everything we can. And that information will tell us whether or not we solve the problem in the end. So I've actually been party to conversations where other consultants have come in for an initial meeting with a prospect, and they've left saying, oh, this is just like the situation at ABC company last year. If the solution is simple, we'll have this solved in 8 weeks. And that's all without even talking to people actually doing the work, going to where the work is done. And that's a recipe for failure. And so one more note here that I'll add to address my earlier comment about my least favorite step, and that being the scoping, is that once you've gone through this discovery exercise, is you can go back and plug in some of the missing data that you have and just confirm, is our scope what it should be? Are we heading to the right destination? So on and so forth. So this is where that kind of, the cycle can go back and forth here a little bit to make sure we get that scope solidified.
That's good feedback. I like your emphasis on taking assumptions out of it. I've heard someone say before, the word assume makes an ass out of you and me because of just what you said, right? You go in with a preconceived notion, and the chances that you're right going into it are probably not a very high chance. So you can get thrown off track pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
So now that we've talked about this piece, I want to turn to Neeti on process design. So the next step here is going to be around designing now what we want to achieve in the future. So from a design standpoint, Neeti, is this best done top down or bottoms up? What's the best approach in your experience?
So I think going back to my earlier comment, it's got to be integrated. It cannot be bottom, cannot be top down. It's got to be a mix of everything. So how do we do it, right? So it sounds simple, but how do we go about it? So I think one of the things is what Kyle had mentioned, that we've got to show respect for the employees and the people involved in the project. So we've got to create the right experience cycle for them. So what does that mean, right? So the experiences that people have are very important because it's gonna create a story about the project for them in their mind, and that story is gonna get repeated over and over again, whether it's positive or negative, to other people whom they come in contact with. So we wanna make sure that that story or that experience that each employee has in terms of this process improvement project is a positive experience. So once the leaders lay out their vision, their job is to ensure that people are having a positive experience about this. So when you have a positive experience, it in turn creates people's beliefs and values around that project, which in turn is going to propel their behaviors, which in turn is going to influence the outcome of this process improvement project. So it's sort of like this karmic circle. So you get step one right, then everything sort of kind of falls into place. And from the leadership perspective, the CEO and anybody in the C-suite must have a compelling story to tell. They've got to lay out the vision and be able to articulate what is the end goal and why are we doing this and what the end result is going to look like. Now, when somebody understands that, they know exactly why they're doing it and where it's going to take them. So it makes it much easier to jump on the train and go along to the right destination. But along with that, we also have to include people who are going to oppose the change as well. So you've got to be able to hear divergent opinions. So we have to recruit key individuals as champions, and then in turn enable them to recruit their champions in turn. How will things be better eventually? You know, where are we going and why are we doing this? So the leaders and the team leads and the stakeholders all have to work in conjunction with each other. So it's kind of like our fingers on our hands. You know, one hand goes up and it's only 5 fingers, but when you join your 2 hands together through each of the fingers, you have a much stronger and compelling team that's going to get the things done. And at the end of the day, regardless of who you are, whether you are the CEO, whether you are the stakeholder, whether you're the admin person, you're the project manager, it doesn't matter. I think we all have to leave our titles behind. We have to forget our titles. And when we start on a project, we've got to check our ego at the door. We've got to be willing to roll up our sleeves, and leaders and project stakeholders have to be visible during this whole process together. So we've got to show a combined front where people see that we're working together, and they must understand that we are all in this together. I always say this, you know, we're all in this together. We are doing it for the good of all of us. So to me, from a process design perspective, It doesn't matter whether it's top down, up down. We have to look at everybody in this together, and we got to leave our titles out the door.
Well, that's a really powerful recommendation, Neeti, in terms of adding someone to the team that you know will oppose throughout. That's oftentimes people get together and form a committee of like-minded thoughts, and that's where things can also maybe not go as planned. So having someone with you that you know will oppose and challenge, that's a great inclusion to the team, and especially to include in the process design. So thanks for that input.
Thank you.
As we move on to optimization, so Kyle, this one I think is right up your alley, and the word experimentation comes to mind here. You put it in the text, but now that everyone has a design in mind, how do we make sure that it's actually going to work when it's out there on its own, living and breathing every day? Kyle, did we lose you on mute?
Oh, sorry, apologies.
Whatever you said was brilliant.
Yeah, no, I forgot it. No, I would just say you start by simply setting up a pilot process and running an experiment. So create this sandbox, and depending on your environment or your industry, this might be a physical pilot process or a virtual one, but set up in that fashion and then run it and observe what happens and document what happens. And then go back and reflect. Did we get the expected results? Solicit feedback from the process stakeholders and ask them what they think, what worked, what didn't work. And if something didn't work, evaluate why. Do that root cause analysis. And then take those learnings and go back into the refine step and incorporate any small process changes that you can to then better the outcome, and then reset and run again and do it over and over until that desired outcome is achieved. Now, I will caveat this with, don't let perfection impede progress, meaning a process improvement that delivers a 50% better result than before is still better than nothing. So don't think you have to get the absolute 100% perfect result in order to go live towards implementation. It's my firm belief that if you can get a new process implemented that gives you a 50% better outcome right now, implement it, and then go back and evaluate and try and get the other 50%, or maybe you just get 30% more over a few more iterations, but get that initial one started as soon as possible.
That's great feedback. Analysis paralysis is sometimes the enemy of progress. So like you said, some results are better than no results. So as you and your teams are going through this step, not only is it important to spend time within it, but to not try and make it perfect before you move on to the next stage, which is implementation. So that's really good feedback for those to consider who have found themselves in that spot before. Well, good. So moving along here to implementation, I want to leave enough time at the end for questions. They are starting to come back in through the chat feature, so continue to ask your questions, and we'll spend a little bit of time here at the end getting to them best we can. So now that we're on to implementation, Neeti, you said this is your favorite part because ideas are easy, but implementation is where it's kind of really the hard part. So when it comes to implementation, what types of tasks are best handled by executives, project leads, and project participants? I asked you that question specifically because I believe you have this concept of everybody jump in where they can, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
Sure. So, first we need to understand the current structure of the company. You got to look around and see, is it a flat organization? Is it hierarchical? Or are they siloed? Or are they matrixed? Before we jump in. And once we understand that, we can move forward. So what is the role of an executive? The executive's got to give a vision. What does the future look like? That's their role, I think, is to lay out that vision. They can provide the vision, but they cannot dictate it. With the project leads, you have to let them lead the project, right? That's why we call them leads. Let them lead the project. And the project stakeholders can help execute the day in and day out the workings of the change management and the project that they're encountering. And all of this works much better at the end if you've got buy-in from the start of the stakeholders, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to be the owners of this. And while we're working through all of this, we also got to keep in mind that finance has to play a role somewhere in here, because as Kyle mentioned, you've got to make improvements, and you've got to measure improvements too. We need to know when we are making changes, what impact does it have? So finance can provide metrics around it, whether it's reduced hours, reduced cost, better customer experience, better EBITDA, whatever it is. And the bottom line is, employees cannot be treated as targets of the change. Rather, they must be seen as these participatory agents of this change. And at the end of the day, they have to find meaning in it, and they've got to be empowered. And if you go back to my first example when I started talking about the international technology firm, the reason they failed is because the human element was missing. And two, Kyle talked about stopping and ensuring that you're going in the right direction. Keep testing along the way and then reset. And in that example of the international firm, by the time they stopped to see if things were working, it was already to the end of the project and had failed. There was no time to reset because they were out of time and they were out of money. And so you never want to wait for something like that to happen. And so again, keys for success, each of these individuals play a role, and I keep saying they have to be integrated.
Yeah, that resonates really well with me. At our firm, implementation is such a big part of what we deliver for our clients. We actually have another planning meeting before implementation happens so that we can all do what you said, which is assign certain parts of the project to key individuals, because everyone needs to participate for the best results possible, in this case for our clients. Well, good. So last but not least here, we have the hard part, as a lot of us have called it, the handoff. So for Kyle, this step is, I think, sometimes missed. And in your experience, is it a common misconception that those who created the change won't actually own it?
It's a great question, and I would just simply start by saying that to have this successful handoff, you need to have involved the people who operate the process day in and day out, involved throughout, and that's why it's on here as the first 3 of the 4 keys for success on handoff. Hopefully, that's not just in my example and what I do now. Hopefully, it's not just me creating a process change and implementing it in a vacuum. It's me working with the stakeholders, working with those who do the work on a regular basis to create and refine this process. That way, when it is time to implement and then hand off and let them own it, they will want to own it because they were involved in creating it themselves versus, oh, Kyle came up with this process, is pushing it on us to do it. Now we have to run it. So I would say it's key to involving those people and continually asking for their input as you are creating a new process. And I'm not the one that going forward will be. This is just an example. I'm not the one that going forward will be entering loan applications, for example, or running an aluminum die cast cell. The banker or the operator need to take that new process and run with it, and it's almost guaranteed that they won't if that change was created in a vacuum and they weren't consulted and involved along the way. Yeah, and then finally, the one last thing there is the follow-up. So the handoff happens. The process is live. They know how to operate it. They're now working it. Then you need to have that follow-up. Too often I've seen this is where the ball is dropped and the handoff happened. The process is running. It's live. And there was no follow-up, and come to find out that it's still, there were issues coming up. It wasn't running as expected because, in the real world, there are all kinds of variables that can come up. You can't plan for everything. And some negative variables were occurring, and the process was not working now as it should, and it was actually having a negative impact potentially on customers. But that follow-up wasn't there, so it didn't happen, and then no one learned about this until there were customer complaints. So it's also important within this handoff plan is to have, a follow-up, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, doing a 30 or 60-day check-in, just to make sure we're not missing any gaps.
That's really critical, that follow-up component that you concluded on. Without proper follow-up, like you said, things fall through the cracks. And then when things fall through the cracks, people lose faith in future process improvement initiatives. So it becomes this snowball effect that if you're not staying on top of what you implemented, it's going to make it very, very hard for you to implement anything in the future, because people will just see them as projects that didn't get enough attention and think that that's going to be the norm going forward.
Exactly.
Yeah. So good. So we talked through 6 steps, and back to the theme of our webinar here, getting to the point. So we wanted to boil it down to 3 really key takeaways. We have some questions here that we're going to get into that I'm sure people may have some other takeaways, but at least from our vantage point, process improvement is often portrayed as flashy, glamorous, easy, harmless, and in reality, it's not that. It's ugly at first. It's usually difficult to deal with, and we just want you to make sure you know that going into your next process improvement initiative. Expect some resistance, plan for it, and navigate the waters, appropriately. And then also following that yogi way, bring the human element into this. Don't get stuck in a Six Sigma or some other type of structure that is in all of the text that we read. Don't forget about the human element. That'll make sure that your process improvement project is successful as it can be. And then, as we've all said, change is constant. We, the panelists, recommend being a change leader instead of a change follower. We hope the information that you've received today in this webinar will give you some of the tools that you need to go forth and conquer. Again, anything offline that you'd like to ask myself or any of the panelists, we're happy to reach out and get back to you with anything you may know. But with that said, we do have a few questions. With a few minutes left here, and again, we will spend a few minutes after the top of the hour if there are more questions. But the first one comes to us via our chat feature, and it says, during scoping, many ideas will seem to make sense. What factors will assure success considering limited time and limited resources are available? So Kyle or Neeti, with that question said, can you offer any advice to one of our listeners?
Yeah, I'll take this one up first, and I can offer a high-level tip here. And I'll just say that improving everything isn't the same as everything improving. And so it's critical for companies, organizations to know what are the critical measures that tell us if our company is delivering on its mission. And I'm talking about 3 high-level metrics. And then when you're evaluating, scoping a project or coming up with new ideas, figuring out how those align with those high-level metrics of success. So, for example, it might be EBITDA, ROE, something along those lines, some sales growth, and say, how does this idea impacting or directly impacting those metrics? And if so, this is something we should be talking about. If it doesn't impact those directly, it doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. It's just going to be less of a priority at this moment. But that kind of having that true north, that objective measure to help determine what goes forward and what doesn't is helpful.
Right, and then backing off that idea, Kyle, I always look at the 80-20 rule, right? So you sit in a room and you're brainstorming and you come up with 10 great process improvement ideas, and given the limited time and resources, which ones do you follow? So I always look at it from the perspective of, okay, which of these ideas is going to move the dial for us? Which is going to have the largest impact? And again, you've got to ask the question, impact in what? What's important to the company at the time? Is it, there needs to be an impact on the people? Is it regarding EBITDA? Is it regarding, some kind of a service delivery model? So once you know what's important to the company, you kind of can figure out, based on the 80-20 rule, which of those 20% of those ideas are going to have 80% of the benefit that is driven by them. So.
Good insights, and I'm glad that question was asked. It's pretty important. Here's another one that came up, which I thought was pretty big picture, but wanted to ask it, is how do you keep members engaged throughout the project? So those who have joined on either voluntarily or were voluntold to join a process improvement initiative, how do you keep them engaged for what can sometimes take months to finish?
So I'll take this one to start with. A couple of things that have worked well for me is in order to keep your employees and teams engaged, they've got to see small wins as you go along. So one of the techniques is share the wins. Make sure that everybody is aware of them. And of course, acknowledge the team members who are bringing the successes. Acknowledge them publicly. Tell the stories about them. Tell the stories about how already those small improvements are making a change in our lives. And thirdly, I think, we are all human again. If you can provide some sort of a bonus or even an outing where the team members get out away from the project once in a while and meet, all of those small things make a huge difference in keeping people engaged over the long run.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it all just comes down to, and we talked about this a little bit in the presentation, but it comes down to communication throughout all 6 steps about, why are we doing this? Where are we headed? Are we making progress? How can we measure progress? Just communicating all that and celebrating the small wins and giving recognition where it's due will keep people engaged and motivated to continue to be involved.
Great question. And for those who have a hard stop at 3 here, if we can go to the next slide, I just wanted everyone to have the opportunity to view the link where they can get Neeti's book, downloadable version when it comes out. So highlowleadership.com. You can visit that and register, and you will be the first recipient of her new book. So we're all looking forward to reading more about some of the philosophies that she shared with us today. Also wanted to thank McDermott and Bull, Ryan, Kyle Kumpf, Profit Recovery Partners, all for helping support this webinar. For those who have to drop off, we do thank you for joining us. There are a couple more questions that came through the chat feature that we want to tackle because they are pretty good ones, but otherwise, for those who have to leave us, thank you for joining. So another question here comes to us from our chat feature, and it's, could you please provide any effective change management philosophies that have worked for you in the past? So for Neeti and Kyle, maybe you've read a book or you've heard of an idea or a philosophy before that you can recommend to our listeners.
Kyle, you want to start with that?
Sure, I can try. It's a great question. That's what this all comes down to is if you don't have that change management in place throughout any change, whether it's large or small, it's likely going to fall apart. And I think it just comes back to setting clear expectations in the beginning and communication of letting everyone know up front, hey, this change is happening. This is what it's going to be. This is what it means. Everyone's probably seen that change curve. I forget where that comes from or who developed it, but you start up a little high and you come down low and then you go back up. And it's just making sure you manage people appropriately through that. And I think that the easiest way to do it is just to have robust communication and set expectations up front so that as few people as possible are blindsided by any changes that are being proposed.
Yeah, this is Mike. To that question, I've really enjoyed the works of an author. His name is Alan Weiss, W-E-I-S-S. And he's a consultant as well, but a lot of his books talk about change management and how to effectively pursue change management, especially when you don't have any authority, which technically consultants do not. So he approaches it from a kind of that human-based element, what people need, what people want. And I've found his books to be very, very enlightening. Again, Alan Weiss, A-L-A-N-W-E-I-S-S. And then another question just came in here. I thought it was a good one, and we may conclude with this one. But I think, Neeti, you even mentioned something about this, that Ryan has a vehicle to create ideas, but someone asked, where do these ideas usually come from? So when someone has an idea for process improvement, who are they usually from?
You know, some of the best ideas that I've seen have come from people at the staff and the senior level, because we're a consulting firm, a tax firm. So the staff and the seniors are the ones who are tackling, you know, new technology every day. They're the ones who are butting heads with different taxing jurisdictions and countries that keep making changes to these forms, and you know, ERP systems keep changing. And so honestly, some of the best ideas that I see come through are from the line level people who are working through these projects day in and day out, are helping our clients, and they have their pulse, they have their finger on the pulse. They know what the issues are. And I always tell them, I said, you know what, you might be able to identify the issues, but the glory is in finding a solution to those pain points. And the seniors and the staff honestly come up with some of the brightest and the most brilliant ideas, many of which we actually have implemented.
Yeah, good. I've experienced the same thing. They can come from anywhere, so the best strategy is just to keep your ears open and not discount where the idea came from, because everyone has something to contribute. At least that's what I believe. All right, good. Well, there are a few more questions, but we're running at time here. So I'm going to go ahead and close the webinar here by saying again, thank you to our sponsors, Neeti, Dewan, Kyle Kumpf, both with a lot of value to add there. And if anybody else has questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to reach out. We'll be more than happy to help you solve any of your process improvement challenges, because we know that there is no shortage of those out there. So again, Neeti, thank you very much. We appreciate your insight and your involvement. Kyle, same thing. Thanks for your perspective as we went through this topic.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, again, look out for the next series of webinars that we have. You will receive notices on our next topic. If there's a certain topic you want to hear about, please feel free to reach out as well. And that will conclude our webinar for today. Thank you so much for joining.